10 or 12 years ago at my quilt study group, people started noting that Maine didn't have a quilt book. A lot of different states have quilt books that talk about the different quilts that have been found in their states and highlight what is specifically interesting about their quilts. Pennsylvania has them by county, there are so many. But Maine didn't have one. And so these friends of mine and colleagues of mine approached me and asked me if I would be interested in writing a book. And it was really an intimidating request because I was learning a lot about quilts, but I didn't know Maine quilts as well as I felt I needed to. So it has taken a long time to learn a lot about them and try and cover as much of the state as I could and get as many different locations and time periods involved. So it's taken about 10 years to get this quilt project off the ground. I called the book Maine Quilts, 250 Years of Comfort and Community. And I called it comfort because there's the physical comfort of having something warm over you, and in Maine winters that's obviously very important. But there's also an emotional comfort to a quilt because someone that you love may have made it for you, or it was made by them and then you wound up with it. And then community was important because so many of the quilts I was finding were informing me about the community that they were in. And a lot of those were what we call album quilts or friendship quilts, where people have signed them and you can do all the genealogical information and try and find the relationships. But some of them were also quilts that were somewhat anonymous, other than knowing about what town they were in or what family made them. One of the fun things working on these quilts was sort of learning what sets Maine quilts apart from other states. And perhaps in the mid-1800s, it's easier to see some differences that set Maine quilts apart. For example, album quilts are quilts that several people make, as usually a group of people make. Sometimes one person might make them, but usually it's a group effort. And they are really posh down in Maryland area. They're very high end. There's a lot of symmetry to them. There's a lot of sort of flow to them. And there's also women who are professionally making sort of kits for women to make the album quilts. Up here, it's anything goes. And people just handed in quilt blocks, and sometimes they got the size right, sometimes they didn't. And then organizers had to make the best of it. But there's a couple of other things that set Maine quilts apart. We're probably the epicenter of what's now being called potholder quilts. It means that each quilt block is sewn completely and bound and quilted before it goes together. So each person, if you're making an album quilt, each person would make their quilt and sew it and bind it and then give it to the organizers who would then stitch it together. And another thing that I find on a lot of mid-1800s Maine quilts is that women would make their quilt block. Let's say it's something called a 9 patch, which is just 9 blocks, like a tic-tac-toe board. And they'd make the 9 patch, for example. But then they put a border around it. And then they put a border around that. So there's one quilt from Dresden from around 1845 where literally half of the blocks have borders upon borders. And that's something that's really quirky in Maine and that's kind of fun. And that quilt, as it turns out, is also an album quilt and is also potholder. So it just rings every bell in terms of it being a Maine style quilt. One of the fun things about the Maine Quilt Project has been that I've been able to include Native American communities in the project because in the mid-1800s, there was a Wabanaki tradition of making the most exquisite applique I have ever seen anywhere. And it's called silk ribbon applique because they start with probably just silk ribbons that were maybe anywhere from a ½ inch wide to 2 inches wide. And then they cut them down and they trace them and they overlay them and they make layers and layers of lace basically with them of different colors. And then they bead them and they put them on personal items of clothing. So we have, in our collection, we have a hat that belonged to Molly Molasses and was probably made by her in the late 1700s. We have Penobscot leggings. And then we have a set of Passamaquoddy cradle board wrappers because Wabanaki swaddled their children in cradle boards when they were very, very young. And this someone made a very special set of cloths for a mother and her baby, and they must have been very special because silk is very fragile, and these have held up very, very well. And those are really striking, and those are from, again, the first part of the 1800s or the very late 1700s. So I'm very excited to be able to bring those forward as part of Maine's quilt tradition. I'm really lucky because I work at the Maine State Museum, and we have probably the biggest collection of quilts in the state, and it's also a tremendous collection. It's really a good collection of quilts. So in terms of drawing on quilts for both the book and the upcoming exhibit, I was lucky to have all of this range of quilts at my fingertips. And the earliest quilt that we have in the collection comes from either Troy or East Troy, and it dates to anywhere between 1770 and 1800. The fabrics in it date from the mid 1700s to the late 1700s, and it probably got put together a little after the fabrics were made. They might have been recycled, we can't tell. But the interesting thing is that the quilt is so early that it was made before East Troy was settled. So, and before Troy was settled. So we're not sure exactly where it was made, but that's our earliest quilt in the collection. The most recent quilt in our collection dates to about 2019, and we have another from 2016. We have another from 2016. And the most recent quilt in the exhibit was completed in November of 2019. So there are some recent quilts in both the exhibit and the book and our collection. And one of the things I'm really struck by with the newest quilts is that there's actually a lot in common with the old quilts. At every time period, you find people who are doing really innovative things. So whether or not it is 1996 and it's Jude Spax from Belfast area who's making this phenomenal, fierce girl, this is titled Girl Warrior, with layers and layers and layers of fabrics and 20 pieces of fabric for each eye of the girl's face. It's tremendous. So much energy. And then you look at quilts that were made in the 1860s in Alexander, Maine, which is way over by the Canadian border. And that quilt looks like Peter Max from the psychedelic 1960s. It looks like Peter Max 1973-ish sort of time travel to Alexander, Maine in 1868. It is bright and crazy and has moons and stars and birds and flowers. It's just so much fun. So every era has people who are doing exciting new things. And every era also has times where people are taking traditional styles and doing something innovative with them. And we have we have a 2016 quilt by Wendy Reed that does that. She uses traditional styles and she turns it into something very modern and interesting and fun. And of course, we have a lot of traditional work, just traditional interpretations of different patterns that are done throughout Maine's history, and they're just gorgeous. And some are very elaborate, some are simple, but they're all really beautiful. We are really looking forward to opening the quilt exhibit when the museum opens. And so please stay tuned for that, and please come see it. It will be the biggest exhibit of historic Maine quilts that there has ever been. It's kind of amazing to say that, but there it is. And the quilts will go from our friend that is, I've mentioned, that is from the mid 1700s to around 1800. It will go from there all the way up to 2019. So I do hope that you'll be able to come and see the exhibit when it opens.